I was doing what Forrest Gump was doing, trying to go a long way on foot. Only I was on a bike. I know better than to run everywhere. In some ways, it made the nation seem bigger. Other ways, it made it seem smaller. But in too many ways, it made it seem like a place with secrets that we were never supposed to learn about. My biking brought me to a very small wood in the rurals of Indiana. I think most people know that the woods in the Midwest are really just a small cluster of trees. There were miles of cornfields on either side in all directions. So it wasn't likely that my camping out in the little spit of trees was really going to be a huge issue for anybody. I'm sure it was somebody's property, but they were probably miles away, having supper most likely. So I bedded down as best as I could, considering I was miles away from any house, and settling into a thick cluster of trees. I guess there were worse places to be settling in for the night. All I would really have to worry about were mosquitoes, and possibly coyotes, and whatever snakes there are in the Midwest, but no bears or anything serious. By the time I shut my eyes and called it a day, I was awfully relaxed and felt like I didn't have anything to worry about. I fell asleep pretty quickly. It didn't last long. I woke up at about 2 a.m. to the sound of what I was sure were footsteps. It troubled me that I couldn't exactly see the source of them since, again, there were open fields on all sides. That meant that wherever the sounds were coming from, it was coming from very close by. I yelled out hello into the darkness, just in case I was indeed being visited by whoever owned the property. Besides, I would not want to have a shotgun shoved in my face and told to leave. But nobody answered. I rattled out a brief explanation as to who I was and what I was doing. This didn't get me any response, unlike I thought. I reached for my flashlight when my eyes saw it. 2 eyes staring back at me. Eyes that were still enough to have been mounted in a sculpture. I prayed that's what it was. I popped on my light and shone it directly into the eyes. They blinked. They were a coppery ambery color and appeared to have this unnatural glow to them. They were set into the face of something that could have been a man at one point in time, except that face and the body were covered in a shaggy, rug-looking fur. It was very reminiscent of satin. Now, you'd have thought I was being visited by a Bigfoot with the size and shape of this thing. I've seen them before, trust me, I'm a believer. But this face wasn't like that at all. The face reminded me of more of a dog, because it had a snout, a muzzle, if you will. The torso was very human, despite being covered in fur that looked thickly matted and poorly kept. This creature, or being, whatever you want to call it, had ears that were very pointy, and kind of reminded me of elves that you see in fantasy fan fiction and movies. Very long, pointed ears, except these were on the top of its head, pointed upwards and very sharp, with little tufts of hair at the end of each. It showed its teeth at the sight of me shining my light on it. I got to see just how yellow they were, and they were grossly sharp. The longer I looked, the more terrified and traumatized I grew, and some deep down instinct inside told me that I should not take any chances with whatever this was. In fact, I believe it was the same fear that a mouse has for a cat, even if that mouse had never seen a cat before. It was a predatory prey instinct, and in this case, I was the prey. It didn't appear to like my light, so I clicked the brightness selector up a notch and shined it directly in its face. That time it winced and began a strange sort of clicking whining noise, as if you were going to hurt it. It was like a whimper, but kind of a scream. It was strange, and I can't really describe it. I prayed on the spot that this was some sort of joke, all in my mind, that this thing baring its teeth, dripping with saliva, had convinced me that I was looking at the real deal. A horrible, horrible looking werewolf. Except I didn't believe in werewolves, so this had to be something else. I kept the light shining in its eyes, and it appeared to drive it crazy. It paced back and forth, and I didn't dare let the light leave its face for an instant. Its pace grew faster, and it was getting more and more frustrated, and I braced myself for this thing to pounce, but it never did. Instead, it growled and growled, and finally bolted away. I had to make a decision. Sleep till sunup, or leave right then. Both seemed like very bad options. I stayed put, but you can bet I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. So how does a creature like that stay hidden in a state like Indiana, where there is so much wide open space to be seen? I just can't help but think I was lucky that I was able to fend it off with just a light. I mean, what do you think? I look back at the story and think, had I tried to run like any normal sane person, this thing would have chased me down, and I would be nothing but a carcass, being fed on somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I felt like my only saving grace in that moment was keeping that light on that thing's face. I don't know why, but it seemed to pacify it for the time being, until it got too agitated and ran off. When you have little kids, camping seems like the ideal way to get away for a few days, without it costing everything. Sure, it might not be exactly luxurious, but when you got 3 children under 5, not a lot is. It's fairly cheap, and you could easily wear your kids out, doing fun stuff in nature. If you do have young kids, you don't have to travel during the hot summer. You can go whenever you like, which was exactly how we found ourselves in the middle of nowhere at the tail end of September. September 27th, to be exact, 2019. We just wanted a few days away from the same 4 walls we were stuck in constantly, and our kids can be able to safely run around. One was learning to ride his bike, while my wife and the baby could finally have some quiet time and maybe be reading. The boys and I were planning to play, go on hikes, and explore. On the first morning, the 5-year-old woke up telling me about Mr. Fluffy. Now, Mr. Fluffy was a dog he had seen in his dreams, who had apparently visited our tent in the night. I thought it was cute, and my wife, who is a teacher, was delighted by his role-playing and imaginary friend development. I was busy cleaning up breakfast when I noticed a very strong, wild smell that turned out to be urine, animal urine, coming from the backside of the tent area. I would learn this later to be whatever this creature was. The boys were very much a pee anywhere kind of kid, but this did not smell like kid urine, or human urine, I guess. But this was way stronger. It was almost like an animal marking its territory. I thought maybe an animal had come to scent the tent in the night, so I did my best to take water and try and wash it away. We spent the day playing games and soon forgot all about it, since it was kind of in passing. But my son, being my son, kept chatting us up about Mr. Fluffy. It was soon time for bed again, and we were all pretty pooped. Sometime during the night, I was awoken by a shuffling noise outside. It wasn't the most unusual occurrence, and we had been told there weren't any dangerous animals living around. No predators, nothing. It was probably a raccoon or maybe a deer, or so I would hope. But the noise did change suddenly, from a snuffle to a low growl, which began to get the hairs on the back of my neck. Then, I could hear this thing walking around outside the tent, and not on 4 legs like an animal would, but 2, thump, 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 as if 2 feet walking, and every thump was a heavy hit on the ground. Not that this thing was stomping, but this thing, whatever it was, clearly weighed a lot, and the growl that emitted from it was terrifying. Somehow my wife, my baby, and my small boys were all fast asleep. How was I the only one awake? Thank God. This thing circled around the tent multiple times, and then finally went silent. It was so quiet outside, you could hear a pin drop. Usually, at this time of the year, crickets outside were abound, but there was nothing. Nothing at all. This terrified me. I was too scared to even move. I don't know what it was outside, but it sounded like a monster. It moved a little more, and I could hear rustling in the bushes nearby. It sounded, whatever it was, to be moving away from us. I waited, and sat there and waited. I didn't even bother to move to check my watch or my phone. I really have no idea how much time passed. 2 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. I don't know. I sat there, trying to hold my breath, just listening to see if this thing was coming back. It didn't appear to, but the few times it circled around our tent, lowly growling and sniffling, as if trying to look for something. I have no idea. The next morning, I hardly slept, imagine that. I told my family that I wasn't feeling well, and that I had suddenly become very ill. Well, we ended up cutting the trip short, and that's the end of that. Looking back, a year plus later, I did not tell my kids or my wife, but I wonder, the whole Mr. Fluffy that my son talked about, had he seen this creature before? I'll never know. My dog had been suffering from constipation, so it meant I was taking him for longer walks and more often. My dog was very shy at the best of times, and sometimes he struggled to go if there were other dogs around, which led me to finding beaten tracks for him so he wouldn't get performance anxiety. I know this sounds like a bad joke, and I hope you're taking me seriously. Although he has been a very shy dog, thankfully, I managed to help him out and find a spot that was comfortable for him. Mainly it sucked because there was poor lighting and you had to watch your step constantly to not trip over rocks and any low-lying branches. Most of the time, I could barely even see with a light, so we never went too far, just enough for him to do his thing. He is normally a very quiet dog, but he seems scared of everything and doesn't like to draw any attention to himself. I was actually really surprised when one cold, wet, dark evening, we had been there for a few minutes, not long enough for the job at hand, when he went nuts, just going crazy, growling, barking, whimpering, and directing his attention towards something over in the trees on the path. I didn't want to end up on my butt, so I kept pulling him back to me, figuring he had had enough and it was time. But it just so happened that it was extra dark, and so I had a more powerful flashlight. So, when I brought him over, I got the shock of my life. I looked up, and I see these glowing red lights coming from the trees. That's when I realized these weren't lights. They were eyes, watching us. They were powerful, whatever they were. I shined the light quickly, and I saw the giant head of what kind of looked like a dog, but resembles more of a hyena, that had these supernatural glowing red eyes. Every cliché of a monster novel put into one, except I was looking at it in real life. I can only see its upper half because it was hidden behind the thick brush and trees, but it looked monstrously huge, very stocky, covered in long, gangly fur. It seemed to be tall and just covered in dark fur, just like I said, standing upright, or maybe on all fours, I couldn't really tell. but it just stood there, staring at me intently, not moving a muscle. In fact, it was so still, I was convinced for a moment it was a Hollywood prop, or somebody in a costume playing a prank, or it was fake. But then it moved its head slightly, lowering it to get a better look. That's when I let out a scream and grabbed my dog. No, I picked my dog up and I ran, and I went as fast as I could, not even caring about tripping over rocks. I was in total fear, and I wasn't going to wait around anymore for this creature to grab me and pull me away. It's safe to say that luckily my dog and I survived, but have we ever gone back to that area since? No. To be honest with you, I don't care what I saw. I don't want to see it again, and I don't want to be around it. That was more than enough for me to know that I don't want to go into the deep woods again.